back to Aussie Med Tuts. In this video, I wanted to do a bit of basic advice on GAMSAT. So to begin with, there is one thing that you can do immediately that will help you on the GAMSAT, help you get a better score, and be a happier person in general, and that's to like this video, subscribe if you haven't already, leave a comment about what you want to see next. Okay, sorry, I have to say that if I'm going to make a YouTube channel, I have to try and, plug it a little bit. I had 4 areas that I want to cover. First off, I wanted to give a quick rundown of GAMSAT. I think there are a lot of videos out there that explain this in much more detail, and I imagine if you're watching this, you probably already watched those, so I'm not going to spend too much time on it. Second thing I'm going to do is explain why the GAMSAT is stupid and doesn't matter, even though you have to do it if you want to get into medicine or dentistry. Third thing I'm going to do is give you advice on where to start, and then the fourth thing I'm going to do is give you my basic tips on how to prepare and perform in each of the sections. I've said it before, I didn't think that I got the most amazing score in the GAMSAT, but I also know that there are people out there struggling a lot, so I'm happy to give my best advice. And then if you want more specific information or details or advice on each of the sections, you can leave a comment or you can find some other videos. If those other videos don't give you enough information, I can always make another video on individual sections. The very first part of this video is an explanation of what the GAMSAT is. The basic idea of a GAMSAT is it's a test that's held twice a year for people that want to get into medicine or dentistry. The test involves 3 sections. Section 1 is a literature comprehension test. It's multiple choice, which is not in any way to say that it's easier. They've got blocks of text, they've got poems, they've got little bits of literature. You've got to read through it, interpret it, comprehend it, as comprehension suggests, and answer the questions in regards to that. The second section on the GAMSAT is the essay section. I say essays, but it's really not necessarily essays. What it is they give you a short abstract prompt like dreams are made of happiness, or I don't know. And you've got to write 2 written responses. They can be essays or they can be narratives, they can be poems. I've heard people get high scores on a lot of those. This is also the section that people say you can improve most upon, and I think that's because if you're writing an essay response to these prompts, it's easy to kind of understand the different areas of an essay and how to improve on all of those areas. Whereas when it comes to poetry and narrative responses, it can be a little more abstract and a little harder to really understand what makes that good. Section 3 is the math science section of the test. Again, we're back to multiple choice here, but an important thing to be aware of is that this isn't like a science test that you might get in high school or even university, where memorizing facts can help you with answering questions. There aren't any questions that are, what is the definition of a mitochondria? It's more a logic and rational based system where they give you all the information you kind of need to be able to work something out that you haven't necessarily learned about before, and then it's your job to interpret that and figure out what the correct answer is. So once you finish the GAMSAT, you get a score out of 100 for each of these sections. The score is averaged with a heavier weight towards the science section for most universities, and by that what I mean is you add the score you got for section 1 to the score you got for section 2, and then you add the score you got from section 3 twice, and you divide all that by 4. That is your weighted average. But some universities just take the 3 scores, add them together, and divide by 3 for a regular average. For me, I don't remember exactly what I got on each section, but my average was 70. And for the year that I did it, 70 was the top 1 percentile. That being said, the cutoff just to get an offer for an interview to get into med at Sydney Uni that year was 69. So, it's like just above that a little bit. And this leads on really well to my next part of this video, which is why the GAMSAT is dumb. So like I said, I got 70, top 1%, first try, really happy that I didn't have to do it again. And that got me into offers for interviews at the 2 universities I was interested in. But I struggle all through med. So even though I managed to get through the GAMSAT first try, med's still extremely hard for me. Then you've got other people that scored not well enough to get in their first try, not well enough to get in their second try, well enough to get in their third try, and they ended up being the top of the class for their cohort. This is somebody I know. Take another example of somebody in my cohort who got in through a special pathway, meaning that they didn't need the same GAMSAT cutoff to get an interview offer, much lower than my GAMSAT, and they do so much better than me. And they didn't come from a science background like I do either. So they definitely earned their place there, and it's fantastic that they had that special pathway entry, because if they didn't, this person that would have performed really well in med, that does perform really well in medicine, and I think will be an amazing doctor, would not have gotten into medicine to begin with. What I'm trying to say is, if you're struggling with the GAMSAT, or if it sounds really scary having to do this big test to try and get in and you're not sure how well you're going to do, all you've got to do is well enough to get through it. Once you're into medicine, it's a whole other game. You might end up being amazing at getting through medicine. You might still struggle through medicine and end up being an amazing doctor. Basically, just don't give up because this part seems daunting or it's a real struggle for you. The third section of this video is where to start. Like any endeavor, you want to get started with the facts. What I would suggest is go to the GAMSAT website where they have information about the test, really understand what they say about the sections as well, because my information and other people on YouTube giving information could be out of date. The other thing that I highly recommend that you jump on top of really soon, if you haven't already, is a website called Paging Doctor. This is a forum where people are trying to get into med at every stage, so those coming out of high school, those preparing for the GAMSAT, those preparing for their interviews, and those that have finished their interviews waiting for an offer, all the way through to current medical students, and I think there are still some doctors on there as well. So jump on there, there's a huge amount of information there, there's lots of resources that everyone shares. I think that's probably the number one thing that I can recommend people do if they're interested in getting into medicine, even if they're not at the GAMSAT stage yet, or even if they're past the GAMSAT stage. Once you've gathered this basic information, I recommend doing some practice questions. You can start preparing and learning things a little bit, but if you do some practice questions from the get-go, you're going to understand where the holes in your information are. So I recommend doing ACER practice questions. ACER is the company that makes the questions for GAMSAT, and I recommend doing these questions instead of other companies that also make GAMSAT questions, as in questions for people to practice on, not actual questions for the GAMSAT. These are your two choices here, ACER or these other companies. These other companies make questions, they're okay, but they're really often not exactly the same as the GAMSAT ones. So I recommend starting with ACER practice questions. ACER releases practice exams and practice questions that you can buy. I recommend starting with doing some ACER practice questions. You don't have to do a whole practice test, because maybe that's a bit of a waste and you'd rather save that until later, but you can do a few questions from each section to give you an idea of what to expect and how to be preparing. Some of these other companies that I mentioned are things like GradReady that have courses, MCAT, GAMSAT Ready, or Gold Standard, Gold Star. There's a few of them out there. I think their questions are really good once you have an understanding of what GAMSAT questions are actually like. All of these other things can give you a chance to practice questions that aren't exactly the same, but will still help you prepare a little bit. Which leads to another thing in regards to preparation. There are courses like GradReady, and they kind of teach you how to do the GAMSAT. If you are completely lost, this might be something for you. However, I have not heard good things about these GAMSAT preparation courses. I don't have a great sense of them. I didn't do one. I got a lot of information from my partner at the time that had done one of these courses. I got textbooks from her and their information from her, and was able to utilize all of that. So what I recommend is, if you're thinking of doing one of these courses, just have a look at reviews, maybe chat to somebody that's done them already or is thinking of doing them, because my information could be out of date again. These could actually be fantastically evolved classes that have moved way beyond what they used to be, and they might have way more up-to-date information than any of us YouTubers or other people that did the GAMSAT years ago. But they cost a lot of money, so, you know, be prepared for that. Now, after courses, there's another thing that you can do that I recommend for part of the test, which is to get a tutor. I had a tutor who was my partner at the time, for section 2 especially, because that's where you write those essays. They've got to be graded, and she already had a sense of how to do that after doing courses where other people graded hers, and that helped me a lot. Her scoring was pretty accurate to what the GAMSAT ended up being, with me starting with scores at like 50 for my essays and ending up around the 70 mark, which is what I got for my essays on the actual GAMSAT. So if you find a good tutor for your essays, it's incredibly helpful. They can just give you tips here and there on things to work on with your essay. You can do a few essays on your own, and then you send them one, they grade it, send it back to you and say, try this, this, and this. One of my kind of general tips for section 1 is to not listen to those people, and ACER, I think, as well, who suggest read widely to prepare for this. What I think helped me the most was just my English classes from high school that had taught me how to interpret passages, taught me a bit about interpreting poetry. So what I would suggest is if you haven't covered certain things like this in high school or in your schooling or in your university, rather than reading widely, it would be much more useful to look into literature comprehension courses if there are short ones online, or even find books that teach you a bit about how to interpret poetry, how to interpret written passages. I think will be way more useful. But if you've already done a few practice questions from the ACE practice exams or practice question sets, you probably know, like, hey, actually, this kind of comes to me naturally, that's not so hard, and maybe you don't need to prepare too much for that section. I honestly don't recall preparing for that section. I thought it was pretty easy. I didn't get as high as I was expecting, but like I said, I ended up getting the average that I needed. My area 3 of this video kind of melded into area 4, which is general tips I have for the GAMSAT. It's a very long test. If I recall correctly, I got up super early, took a train to wherever the test venue was. There were hundreds of people there, and the test ended up being like 7 hours long, because section 1 is like an hour and a half or 2 hours. Section 2 is combined with section 3 and it's like an hour. Section 3 is like 3 hours, and you've got a little break in the middle, you've got breaks in between the tests, so it ends up being an incredibly long day. Because it's such an intense and long test that requires focus throughout the entire thing, with time pressures, you have to be aware that if you're working really hard all the way up to it, you might be too burnt out by the time you get to the test, especially if you've been doing lots of practice tests. So my advice is start slow. Do like 30 minutes of preparation a day, if that. Just get an idea of where you want to start. Do a practice test here and there, but not in the full 8 hours. So do a practice section 1, do a practice section 2, and do a practice section 3 on different days. Remember that where you start doesn't dictate where you're going to go. I started with 50s on my essays and ended up getting that up to 70. You might start even lower and get even higher. So just don't give up on yourself. If what you're doing isn't working, take a breath, give yourself a day, consider taking other approaches. Finally, like any endeavor in life, working on your own mental health, your physical health, your diet, your sleep, all of these things tie together to make you your peak possible self. If you do all of these things, apply the basic tips, and start looking into the specific tips and methods that will help you as an individual, I think you have an extremely good chance of doing well on the GAMSAT. And if you need more help beyond this, let me know. I'm happy to make another video, but there are also lots of other videos out there and lots of other information that you can go through when you feel you need it. Okay, that's all I've got for you now, so I'll leave it there and I'll see you next time.